Okay, I'm kind of going to give you a little bit of an overview of where Hohokam archaeology was maybe 30, 40 years ago and what kinds of things we've been working on in the last 40 years or so. Now, my point of departure today is Dr. Emil Haury's excavations at the site, the famous site, the most famous Hohokam site of all, Snaketown, located on the Gila Indian Reservation, just outside of Chandler. Dr. Haury was actually my doctoral chairman at the University of Arizona. I was fortunate enough to get to know him somewhat, as were some of the other guys here today. Now, Doc, as I say at the bottom, Doc literally wrote the book on Hohokam archaeology. There had been one major excavation reported in the desert or in the 1930s, until Doc went back to Snaketown in the mid-60s. It took him 10 years, and he ultimately published the Hohokam. It's the second book on Snaketown, Excavations at Snaketown 64-65. So what I've done here, to give you a baseline, is this is the list of problems that Dr. Haury worked on when he went to Snaketown in the 60s. And basically, Hohokam culture was very poorly outlined, very poorly known. The chronology was not well understood. You can see I threw this in because you can just see it's like spaghetti. This is what the different versions of the chronology looked like at the time. Some people started the culture 1,000 years later than other people. The other thing about Hohokam that's really held us back is we have no tree rings in the desert, unlike you lucky folks up here. So we can't just send in wood and get dates. So the chronology, as Doc used to always say, if you don't have a good chronology, it's hard to do anything else beyond that. He basically set up the chronology that we still use today, although it's been altered, because at that time, Snaketown was the only big site we knew anything about. And at a conference in 1987 that Haury attended, he said in 1987, Hohokam archaeology was about 40 years behind Anasazi because of basically the lack of work. So since 1987, it's just been continuous field work in the desert, and we've caught up a lot with research that had been conducted since the 1800s in Anasazi. So we got a late start. He basically defined the inventory of Hohokam material culture, pottery, artifacts of all kinds, the architectural sequence, and he introduced us to, did some very important work on a couple of architectural features that are not known among the Anasazi. Those include ball courts and platforms. And for a lot of reasons, people scratched their head for decades thinking, Hohokam, it certainly doesn't look Anasazi. And finally, there was agreement that this is something separate. Now we understand that it has very clear relationships with the cultures of northern Mexico, from where these features are well known for many years. I'm going to come back to platforms here. This is an early one that Doc excavated at Snaketown. Very quickly, what I did to kind of boil this down was I listed a number of topics that are now of current among practicing archaeologists, like those of us here. And then I counterbalanced it. These are a lot of the research problems, and these are the scales of analysis. So one of the things that's really developed in the last generation is what scale are you working on? As we become to learn more about Hohokam villages and artifacts, we can see how they operate at different scales. So for instance, these questions, how were their settlements organized? What was their art like? What were their trading relationships? These are basic questions you would ask of any culture that you're trying to define. And in this early end of Hohokam research, we still need to know about all these questions. And you'll hear about some of this in the other lectures today. Then you can take any one of those issues and you can put it on a different scale. Do you want to talk about settlement patterns locally, or do you want to talk about them regionally, or how do settlement patterns compare globally? you can kind of relate these scales of analysis to those problems. Yeah, you with me on that? Threw in here a couple of some of the major references since Haury's volume. There are others, but some of us are in some of these books. This one, I don't know if it's still in print. It's probably one of the most widely known. This one is about out of print. This one I actually edited and is available in a limited fashion. But I think one thing I want to point out here is that these are both dated 91, and this was like 2000. So, and these were really seminal volumes where those of us were able to sit down and put a lot of data and thoughts into these long books, long articles, and they have been used a lot in the last 20 years. And there's been a lot of field work since then and a whole new generation of archaeologists. And I think we're well at the point where we need to start doing this again. And here I show a couple of what we call popular volumes. This one I did notice, I checked before I came in, this one is available in your bookstore, or it can be ordered. A bunch of short articles by 20 different authors. The Hohokam are probably best known for their irrigation agriculture, which Jerry's going to talk about. You can't hardly talk about the Hohokam without knowing that these people were responsible for engineering the most elaborate irrigation systems in North America and compare favorably to almost any irrigation system found in Mesoamerica, if not this side of Peru. So one of their most famous accomplishments, here's Doc Haury standing in one of his canals at Snaketown. My point here simply is I should mention that through this irrigation system, they grew the basic triad, and anyone who's had corn, beans, and squash, which might have been some people's lunch today, we can thank these Native Americans because that's where we get these crops from. Also, we've learned in the last 20, 30 years, the Hohokam were the premier exporters of cotton and probably cotton products. Cotton was not grown on the Colorado Plateau until after AD 1000. It had been grown in the desert for 2,000 years before that. That the cotton that was up here came from down there, most likely. That's just one aspect of their very elaborate exchange system. So here I'm talking about site structure is a common term for the last 20 years. And basically by site structure, I have a definition here. We're really talking about the internal organization of a site. What is the spatial relationships between features and artifacts, the built environment and material culture? And just a couple of examples. One site I've been working is Gatlin. We're talking about the site layout. It's very interesting to point out here. Here's the big platform, the ball court, the village center, the great plaza, ceremonial public center. Look how these mounds are all sort of laid out in street-like fashion, which is pretty apparent on this map. Another big topic that Dr. Wilcox has been involved in is the organization, the internal organization of sites, having to do with how were families organized into larger groups, how were they expressed architecturally, materially. So we've actually found patterns. This is an example of a Hohokam village where you see how these house groups are laid around local plazas, cemetery areas, earth ovens and such. And this would be a pre-AD 100 pattern. This is a site I actually excavated, which is a post-AD pattern, post-11 AD, 1100 AD, I'll get that right. Platform mound. You see how it's laid out here. Well, if you look very quickly, you can see that these colors of red, blue, and yellow are repeated in all sections of the village. So that's a pattern of organization, the kind of thing I'm talking about. That these patterns of village layout in Hohokam villages is one of the more recent discoveries, and it's still a focus of research. We can talk about settlement pattern on a much larger scale. If we want to talk about a term you may hear over and over again, it's called the Phoenix Basin, which is basically what we used to call the Hohokam core area, where the Salt River and the Gila River converge. And that would be, in here. If we want to look at the distribution, for instance, the post-1100 distribution of platform mounds, that map tells you a lot. For instance, it tells you that this platform mound system was very tightly tied to the rivers. You can just see that at a glance on this scale. Since then, we found little platforms away from the rivers, but whenever we find them, they tend to be small and somewhat attenuated. So we know that the main pattern is riverine. Then if we want to compare on a larger scale, we can start talking about Hohokam and Chaco and Cayena and Mimbres. So we can compare now. We have enough data where we can compare on those scales as well. Hohokam society, as we've learned, was very highly integrated. I put together a map some decades ago to just try to illustrate this, of all of the products that were moving around the state. And it's just kind of a device to show this interaction. Everything from basic tools, grinding stones, metates, to shell ornaments, obsidian points, specialized stone items. Most of these things were made by craftsmen at different villages, and then they were circulated throughout the region. And we know that because now we're able to do sourcing of different materials, like sourcing of pottery, Dr. Abbott's going to talk about, stone, obsidian. We can now source these things scientifically so we can actually start developing maps of how they're moving around. I suspect also that things like corn, cotton, these things are being moved around too. One of the biggest questions we still have not answered, now that we can say for a fact that Hohokam society was highly integrated through exchange, what we can't say in any factual sense is how was this exchange organized? Was it organized vertically in any way? Was it primarily horizontal? How, was it just entrepreneurial? These kinds of questions. Did it have any relationship to the larger aspects of society in terms of local headmen, chiefs, whatever you want to call them? There are all kinds of questions about those kind of relationships. And also you can just see how lovely this pottery is. To me, I still think that it's one of the things that got me intrigued originally. Platform mounds, I've done some work with those. I put together some time ago what I thought at the time, this is at least 10 years old, what we can say about these platforms that Dr. Haury first recognized early on at Snaketown is he dug one that dated to around 1050, 1100. We know these platform mounds replaced ball courts about that time, and they lasted until at least 1350. So I tried to piece together from different sites, this being Snaketown, this being Gila Bend, this site where I've worked. I think this is Escalante where I worked, and this is Casa Grande. Now the one thing about these things is they're all to scale. All these sites are drawn to scale. So you can see that through time, they keep getting bigger and bigger scale. So I think that's a very important observation to make. Another one is that they follow the history of Mesoamerican mounds in the sense that they're built up and over, just like the ancient temples in Mesoamerica. They build on top of them, then there's a new one on every generation or every time there's a new king. The platforms you see in the Hohokam region are that way. A question I had is when I did the reconstruction of Gatlin, a little stepped pyramid, very small, temple on top, looks to my mind an awful lot like the very well-known site of Coquilco, which is in Mexico City. Huge, massive. I mean, Gatlin is probably, 1/50th, not even 1/50th the size. But the point is that they are very similar in their characteristics, and the Gatlin platform, which is at Gila Bend, is a full 1,000 miles separated from and 1,000 years separated from this mountain in Mexico. So it speaks something to the tradition of these features in the larger area. We also find parrots. There's the remains of a parrot found in this platform. So it brings to mind the question of how many Mesoamerican ideas, symbols, concepts might have also been coming up and introduced into the Hohokam area. We can't really talk about the Hohokam people without talking about the historic populations, the O'odham and the human-speaking people to the west. It is through the history of these people, the ethnographies and their stories, what they're willing to tell us, it's how we put more fabric, how we fill in the picture to a great extent of how things worked, how things might have worked in the prehistoric period. I always like to tell this story that if you haven't heard it, the saguaro, of course, is sort of I use the saguaro as a metaphor for the Sonoran Desert. The O'odham refer to saguaros as people, only they're people who do not move. So, I mean, that kind of expresses the close relationship between, in this case, the saguaro, the desert environment, and the people. I'm going to finish today with what I consider to be maybe a lesson that we can learn. One of the things about Hohokam, if you look at their artifacts and their art and their symbolism, you can derive this conclusion from those alone, but O'odham people have told me as well, it is really all about water. There's hardly any ceremony in O'odham culture that doesn't at some point talk about rain, water, fertility, that general theme. So if we look at this, here's some rock art. We have water symbol, corn symbol, and this is the planet Venus. So we look at these shells, these wonderful shells, that these all date somewhere 700 to 1,000 probably. Well, if you look at them, the shells themselves are from the ocean, which of course is water. So the shells themselves represent water. Lightning symbols are oftentimes carved as frogs, another water symbol. And in this case, this one has turquoise. Turquoise, of course, is the godstone. It is both water and sky. So you can see this water symbolism just permeated Hohokam society. And, of course, one of our biggest concerns going forward is water. And if you listen to the people in Phoenix, policymakers will tell you that the #1 issue going forward in Arizona will be water. And what we've done with more and more people is we've thrown more and more technology and more resources and bigger scale to keep bringing water in from further distances. And kind of an analog to what the Hohokam did. So I think my point would be is the Hohokam managed their environment very successfully for some 1,500 years. Well, we've yet to be at it for 150 years. So if we can match the successful run of Hohokam, then we will be doing well. That's it. Thank you.